Book 2, Tom Outland's story, Section 4 of The Professor's House by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 2, Tom Outland's story, Section 4. Blake and I got over to the mesa together for the first time early in May. We carried with us all the food we could and an axe and spade. It took us several days to find a trail leading from the bottom of the box canyon up to the cliff city. There were gaps in it. It was broken by ledges too steep for a man to climb. Lying beside one of these, we found an old dried cedar trunk with toe notches cut in it. That was a plain suggestion. We felled some trees and threw them up over the gaps in the path. Toward the end of the week, when our provisions were getting low, we made the last lap in our climb and stepped upon the ledge that was the floor of the cliff city. In front of the cluster of buildings there was an open space like a courtyard. Along the outer edge of this yard ran a low stone wall. In some places the wall had fallen away from the weather, but the buildings themselves sat so far back under the rim rock that the rain had never beat on them. In thunderstorms I've seen the water come down in sheets over the face of that cavern, without a drop touching the village. The courtyard was not choked by vegetation, for there was no soil. It was bare rock, with a few old, flat-topped cedars growing out of the cracks, and a little pale grass. But everything seemed open and clean, and the stones, I remember, were warm to the touch, smooth and pleasant to feel. The outer walls of the houses were intact, except where sometimes an out-jutting corner had crumbled. They were made of dressed stones, plastered inside and out with daub, and were tinted in light colors, pink and pale yellow and tan. Here and there a cedar log in the ceiling had given way and let the second-story chamber down into the first. Except for that, there was little rubbish or disorder. As Blake remarked, wind and sun are good housekeepers. This village had never been sacked by an enemy, certainly. Inside the little rooms, water jars and bowls stood about, unbroken, and yucca fiber mats were on the floors. We could give only a hurried look over the place, as our food was exhausted, and we had to get back over the river before dark. We went about softly, tried not to disturb anything, even the silence. Besides the tower, there seemed to be about 30 little separate dwellings. Behind the cluster of houses was a kind of back courtyard running from end to end of the cavern, a long, low twilight space that got gradually lower toward the back until the rim rock met the floor of the cavern, exactly like the sloping roof of an attic. There was perpetual twilight back there, cool, shadowy, very grateful after the blazing sun in the front courtyard. When we entered it, we heard a soft trickling sound, and we came upon a spring that welled out of the rock into a stone basin, and then ran off through a cobble-lined gutter and dripped down the cliffs. I've never anywhere tasted water like it, as cold as ice, and so pure. Long afterward, Father Duchesne came out to spend a week with us on the mesa. He always carried a small drinking glass with him, and he used to fill it at the spring and take it out into the sunlight. The water looked like liquid crystal, absolutely colorless, without the slight brownish or greenish tint that water nearly always has. It threw off the sunlight like a diamond. Beside the spring stood some of the most beautifully shaped water jars we ever found. I gave Mrs. St. Peter one of them, standing there just as if they'd been left yesterday. In the back court we found a great many things besides jars and bowls, a row of grinding stones, and several clay ovens, very much like those the Mexicans use today. There were charred bones and charcoal, and the roof was thick with soot all the way along. It was evidently a kind of common kitchen, where they roasted and baked, and probably gossiped. There were corn cobs everywhere, and ears of corn with the kernels still on them, little like popcorn. We found dried beans, too, and strings of pumpkin seeds and plum seeds, and a cupboard full of little implements made of turkey bones. Late that afternoon, Roddy and I crossed the river and got back to our cabin to rest for a few days. The second time we went over, we found a long winding trail leading from the cliff city up to the top of the mesa, a narrow path worn deep into the stone ledges that overhung the village, then running back into the wood of stunted piñons on the summit. Following this to the north end of the mesa, we found what was left of an old road down to the plain. But making this road passable was a matter of weeks, and we had to get workmen and tools from Tarpon. It was a narrow footpath, barely wide enough for a sure-footed mule, and it wound down through Black Canyon, dropping in loops along the face of terrifying cliffs. About 100 feet above the river, it ended, broke right off into the air. A wall of rock had fallen away there, probably from a landslide. That last piece of road cost us 3 weeks' hard work and most of our winter's wages. We kept the workmen on long enough to build us a tight log cabin on the mesa top, a little way back from the ledge that hung over the cliff city. While we were engaged in road building, we made a shortcut from our cabin down to the cliff city and Cow Canyon. Just over the cliff city, there was a crack in the ledge, a sort of manhole, and in this we hung a ladder of pine trunks spliced together with light chains, leaving the branch forks for footholds. By climbing down this ladder, we saved about 2 miles of winding trail and dropped almost directly into Cow Canyon, where we meant always to leave one of the horses grazing. Taking this route, we could at any time make a quick exit from the mesa. We were used to swimming the river now, and in summer our wet clothes dried very quickly. Bill Hook, the liveryman at Tarpon, who'd sheltered old Henry when he was down and out, proved a good friend to us. He got our workmen back and forth for us, brought our supplies up onto the mesa on his pack mules, and when one of us had to stay in town overnight, he let us sleep in his hay barn to save a hotel bill. He knew our expenses were heavy and did everything for us at a bottom price. By the 1st of July our money was nearly gone, but we had our road made and our cabin built on top of the mesa. We brought old Henry up by the new horse trail and began housekeeping. We were now ready for what we called excavating. We built wide shelves all around our sleeping room, and there we put the smaller articles we found in the cliff city. We numbered each specimen, and in my daybook I wrote down just where and in what condition we had found it, and what we thought it had been used for. I'd got a merchant's ledger in Tarpon, and every night after supper, while Roddy read the newspapers, I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote up an account of the day's work. Henry, besides doing the housekeeping, was very eager to help us in the ruins, as he called them. He was more patient than we, and would dig with his fingers half a day to get a pot out of a rubbish pile without breaking it. After all, the old man had a wider knowledge of the world than either of us, and it often came in handy. When we were working in a pale pink house with 2 stories and a sort of balcony before the upper windows, we came on a closet in the wall of the upstairs room. In this were a number of curious things, among them a deerskin bag full of little tools. Henry said at once they were surgical instruments, a stone lancet, a bunch of fine bone needles, wooden forceps, and a catheter. One thing we knew about these people, they hadn't built their town in a hurry. Everything proved their patience and deliberation. The cedar joists had been felled with stone axes and rubbed smooth with sand. The little poles that lay across them and held up the clay floor of the chamber above were smoothly polished. The door lintels were carefully fitted. The doors were stone slabs held in place by wooden bars fitted into hasps. The clay dressing that covered the stone walls was tinted, and some of the chambers were frescoed in geometrical patterns, one color laid on another. In one room was a painted border, little tents like Indian teepees in brilliant red. But the really splendid thing about our city, the thing that made it delightful to work there, and must have made it delightful to live there, was the setting. The town hung like a bird's nest in the cliff, looking off into the box canyon below, and beyond into the wide valley we called Cow Canyon, facing an ocean of clear air. A people who had the hardihood to build there, and who lived day after day looking down upon such grandeur, who came and went by those hazardous trails, must have been, as we often told each other, a fine people. But what had become of them? What catastrophe had overwhelmed them? They hadn't moved away, for they had taken none of their belongings, not even their clothes. Oh yes, we found clothes, yucca moccasins, and what seemed like cotton cloth, woven in black and white. Never any wool, but sheepskins tanned with the fleece on them. They may have been mountain sheep. The mesa was full of them. We talked of shooting one for meat, but we never did. When a mountain sheep comes out on a ledge hundreds of feet above you, with his trumpet horns, there's something noble about him. He looks like a priest. We didn't want to shoot at them and make them shy. We liked to see them. We shot a wild cow when we wanted fresh meat. At last we came upon one of the original inhabitants, not a skeleton, but a dried human body, a woman. She was not in the cliff city. We found her in a little group of houses stuck up in a high arch we called the Eagle's Nest. She was lying on a yucca mat, partly covered with rags, and she had dried into a mummy in that water-drinking air. We thought she had been murdered. There was a great wound in her side. The rib stuck out through the dried flesh. Her mouth was open as if she were screaming, and her face, through all those years, had kept a look of terrible agony. Part of the nose was gone, but she had plenty of teeth, not one missing, and a great deal of coarse black hair. Her teeth were even and white, and so little worn that we thought she must have been a young woman. Henry named her Mother Eve, and we called her that. We put her in a blanket and let her down with great care, and kept her in a chamber in the cliff city. Yes, we found 3 other bodies, but afterward. One day, working in the cliff city, we came upon a stone slab at one end of the cavern that seemed to lead straight into the rock. It was set in cement, and when we loosened it, we found it opened into a small dark chamber. In this there had been a platform of fine cedar poles laid side by side, but it had crumbled. In the wreckage there were 3 bodies, 1 man and 2 women, wrapped in yucca fiber, all in the same posture and apparently prepared for burial. They were the bodies of old people. We believed they were among the aged who were left behind when the tribe went down to live on their farms in the summer season, that they had died in the absence of the villagers and were put into this mortuary chamber to await the return of the tribe, when they would have their funeral rites. Probably these people burned their dead. Of course, an archaeologist could have told a great deal about that civilization from these bodies, but they never got to an archaeologist, at least not on this side of the world. End of Book 2, Tom Outland Story, Section 4.